So, in terms of how I am thinking about and writing about human rights, is it kind of starts from the presumption that we kind of see in our everyday, in that the way that human rights history happens is that it comes from the West. It is an imposition from the West. We hear that a lot in the Philippines. We heard that a lot in the Philippines, that human rights is nothing more than a colonial Western imposition. And, there is certainly some truth to that. But in the work that I'm doing, I want to mess with that a little bit. Not necessarily as like in a origin story type of thing, or in a way that we're saying, no, it actually comes from the East, or like, because I think those categories themselves are problematic and we want to mess with those a bit. But more in terms of thinking about human rights, at least in the martial law period, as something that people in the Philippines were shaping as well, right? Like that they were helping define as well, right? Like it was something that they saw happening in the rest of the world, but it was something that they wanted to get involved with in terms of shaping. And one of the ways that I always point out, I want to point out that, Filipino activists were shaping human rights is, they messed around, and like they fought back against, requirements that rights groups had, like in terms of prisoner of conscience requirements, which is like you had to be a peaceful activist to be the beneficiary of human rights. And Filipino activists, like pointed out that, what if you are engaged in armed struggle or armed resistance? And it is like it is something that they debated, they fought back against, and they tried to get support for activists that were, not seen as the ideal type of activists in terms of like the peace activist. Over the last decade or so that I've been writing about human rights, there's been a lot of really important and critical work on rights and its limitations, right? Like, we understand the limitations of rights, right? Like that it is, perhaps not the way that we are going to find, like ultimately find the liberation that many of us seek. And I think this work is really important, and we really have to engage in that work deeply and understand that work deeply. In some sense, though, what my work does is, I start from the vantage point that the activists that I'm studying that were engaged in human rights activism already knew about the limitations of rights. They knew that, it could not do everything that they needed it to do. And yet they engaged in that work anyway, right? And so I'm kind of interested in that sort of navigation of like, what were they doing? What were they thinking through? How were they approaching this as a tactic that would kind of preserve some of their more revolutionary aims, right? Like, but that could be useful in the short term. And that's something that I think is useful in terms of engaging with human rights during the martial law period, or engaging in the study of human rights activism during the martial law period. Samuel Moyn has called human rights like something that people perceive to be the last utopia, in that human rights as an institution or as an ideal for many people represented a way that was a little bit outside of the Cold War conflict between communism and liberal democracy, right? Like it was like something a little bit different, a third way. Um, and what Samuel Moyn tracks, and others track, is that there comes to be a lot of institutional and financial backing for human rights during this time period. And this is what grassroots Filipino activists were engaging with, or were trying to access, right? Human rights funding, right? Like in terms of funding from organizations like Amnesty International. There was a Dutch group called Novib that they tried to reach out to and get funding from. So grassroots human rights activists in the Philippines wanted international groups to provide amplification for human rights injustices that were happening in the Philippines, and funding for grassroots work to continue in the Philippines. So this is kind of the where the tension existed for Filipino activists, right? They had to frame the human rights work that they were doing in a way that would get them funding, that would allow, like, that would make these groups comfortable with giving them money, right? And and this was the kind of back and forth that grassroots activists had with human rights organizations throughout martial law. Now, grassroots human rights activists in the Philippines also knew that for these international groups to kind of to heighten their profile, to say that they were supporting human rights activism in the third world, the Philippines was an important site for that, right? The Philippines, as like kind of known as a Christian nation, an English speaking nation, one that is like very clearly under a dictatorship, right? Like having support for the Philippines within your broader institutional profile, like kind of heightens the legitimacy of the international human rights work that these institutions were doing. And so this is kind of the space that grassroots activists are navigating. So they would write funding applications that would say we're trying to support detainees that are detained under martial law, but they would push the envelope a little bit as well. It's like, well, we want wellness programs, we want education programs, we want scholarships for detainees' kids. We want training programs for when detainees are released. We want these different kinds of this kind of indirect and direct assistance to poor people and to activist groups. And they would continuously try to push the envelope, and then the broader international groups would also kind of try to rein them in. And so there's this kind of time period during martial law where I'm arguing, like, these human rights activists knew that they could push the envelope a little bit, like, and that they could push for support a little bit, because they had control over like the grassroots movements. They had like a broad network of activists that could help them out, and they could perform to the requirements of like these international human rights agencies while also asking for something more. I think one of the things that excites me the most about this work that I'm currently doing is that I think there are so many lessons to draw from the building of diasporic activism. And this is through the engagement of grassroots activists in the Philippines and solidarity activists abroad, and the Filipino diaspora abroad also, like that are all kind of in many ways in this work together to fight against the Marcos dictatorship. And one of the biggest lessons that I come away with in terms of going through the archive of the diasporic work that these folks did is that it's okay to have a lot of tactics, to try a lot of different tactics. These activists tried everything, and there were a lot of things that they tried that just didn't work. And so they stopped that. And there were things that they tried that did work. And so they did that for a while. And there are things that they tried that worked that continued to work, right? And I think this teaches us about the sort of relationship between opposition, resistance, revolutionary movements, and those in power, right? Like, because these activists also understood that those in power will also learn, right? That they will also kind of develop different strategies. And this is kind of the ongoing work that activists need to address, right? Like, what will work in this moment? What can we try in this moment? What gets opened up by trying different kinds of tactics. Beyond that, of course, like, there's the work that diasporic activists did to amplify what was going on in the Philippines. And for me, this is a really interesting material history, because you can actually track activists in the Philippines gathering stories from detainees in the prison camps, printing those stories on V-type mimeographs, like in people's basements, and then making sure that those newsletters would get into the backpacks or the luggage of people that were doing exposure tours or tourist tours in the Philippines. And then when those folks get back to the United States or to Canada, they would get those to the diasporic activists in those spaces, and they would reprint it in their newsletters and pass out those newsletters in churches to try to educate people about what is happening in the Philippines. And so like there is that really important work of amplification, but more important about that amplification, it is to kind of outline the work of activism, right? We can't just say amplify, 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 or do this. There's actual material work that happens. There are people that have to do that labor, right? That there are people that have to do the work of logistics in activist movements. And I think that's something that these activists really teach me, right? Like attend to the work, attend to who is doing the work, attend to the sort of gendered labor that is happening in these spaces. And we have learned this from Black feminists who have critiqued, right, like our focus on the charismatic preacher or the activist leader that does the speeches, right? But this is, I think, one more instance where we can kind of attend to the material work of movement building. I think these activists also, like in their diasporic work, they teach me that there are really important contingencies and strategies that one can take advantage of. But you also have to be aware of that sometimes these things have a limited time horizon, right? Like a certain moment might require a certain kind of coalition, right? For like, let's say for opposing Marcos, right? Like, or opposing martial law. But that might bring together, people whose, politics or political dreams and political visions might not fully align in the future. And we have to kind of address how we do that work, right? Like how we make use of that limited contingency, that moment of possibility, and then readjust and rebuild. And I guess one more thing, right? Because this is the way that all of this gets addressed during the movement and also gets passed on to us and to our generation is through intergenerational and international study, right? And that for me is something that I'm learning from what I'm trying to write through, but I have kept with me from the conversations that I've had and the things that I've been able to read that these people produced, right? Like they were committed to learning from their elders and learning from people in different places and in different contexts. And I think that's really critical here. The first example is in newsletters that people would produce in the mid 70s in the Philippines that would kind of highlight different detentions or different things that were happening in the Philippines. And one of the things that I found that these newsletters would sometimes do is they would talk about political detention elsewhere, right? Like they would talk about political detention in somewhere like South Korea as a way to talk about kind of talk about both like the sort of the international reach of authoritarian politics, but also as a way to critique Marcos without naming Marcos, right? Like because there were many things that were happening that were very similar, right? So there is this sort of hint of that there. But also to the international, in terms of internationalist and intergenerational study and debate, the example that I always think of is there was an activist for KDP, which was a U.S. or North America-based organization in the 1970s. And he was studying for a master's degree in Philippine studies in Boston. He was from the West Coast. He had gone to Boston to study for a master's degree and started working on a Boston-based newspaper, called I think it's called the Philippine Information Bulletin. And he was working on that newspaper, and He was working through his ideas, ideas related to anti-martial law activism, to histories of Marxism, through things like that. And he, published some of his thoughts and some of his, critiques of different movements. He publishes his thoughts in this newspaper in Boston, and a couple of weeks later, that same newsletter publishes a response from a gentleman named William Pomeroy. William Pomeroy was, like also an activist in like the Philippine radical movement that was part of the old Communist Party of the Philippines and was then, I think, living in England. But William Pomeroy writes a response and kind of tries to tries to convince this younger activist about like what the appropriate kind of appropriate response to the Marcos dictatorship was. And they didn't agree. And this was a really tense argument, right? But there is, right, like there is something there, right? Like there is like this kind of this old head and this younger intellectual engaged with each other. And William Pomeroy is someone that kind of comes up a little bit later too, because detainees in the detention camps would start would do things like trying to do art in the camps, or try to plant trees, or do creative work. And a gentleman named Edicio de la Torre, who himself was like a political activist that was in detention, um, pointed out in one of the camps that he is in, right, like that he was in, like that he was inspired by how William Pomeroy and his wife Cecilia Pomeroy, how they did creative work while they were in the detention camps, right? Like, and so this kind of recollecting of like what was going on in past movements, even though like for these newer movements, those past movements had a lot of faults to them, right? Like, or like they had a lot that they disagreed with, but there was still like lessons for them to draw from that, or debates to be had, a conversation to be had about how to address their contemporary moment. And those are some of the examples that I sort of think of. And I think this happens even today, right? Like there are many of us that are writing about the martial law period. And there have been many martial law era activists that had passed on, but there are still many that are around. And they still have things to teach us, right? Like they have still have ways to point to us, like, you're wrong on this, right? Like I think and we might disagree, right? Like, but there is an incredible value in that, I think, in that kind of conversation, in that kind of debate, in that fight. I think there can be something productive drawn out of that. Yeah, writers and thinkers that have deeply informed uh, how I approach my work. I think, I mean, and there's so many, because I do really believe that for the most part we work in a field where there are so many people that are incredibly generous and incredibly brilliant, and I feel the benefit of that almost every day that I work. People that have deeply affected me, like the first group, and this is not an exhaustive list, but Christine Balance, Augusto Espiritu, Robin Rodriguez, and Genevieve Clutario. And I group these four together for the care that they take in their intellectual work, for the care that they take in building and nurturing the field, and for the example that they all offer in how they move throughout the world. And all four of these people have been like really important mentors to me in various ways, and not always in the ways that they give me like verbal advice. It just mentors to me in watching how they act, and how they support. In terms of work, Robin Rodriguez's work, Migrants for Export, is the work that at an early stage in my interest in Philippine and Philippine American studies helped me understand why I'm here in the United States, right? Help me understand why my parents moved to the United States, and help me understand the sort of structural conditions and legal and political decisions that folks made that resulted in the on the ground navigations that my parents that my parents had always described to me. And Robin gave me an explanation for that, a language for that. And I think that continues to be a book that I revisit. Nefertiti, of course, right? Like I can never think about globalization in the same way after reading her work. I'm always now pushed to think about the production of disposability, right? Like and how that must be central to our analysis. And then, like not only does she do that, right? Like she also pushes us to think about what life making and world making can look like under such dire conditions, under this kind of globalization that we exist in, if we start from the launching points that she offers us. Rick Baldo's um, the deep historical detail of the work is something that I'm always inspired by. The ways that Third Asiatic invasion maps out the social, the legal, the media, and how that all of this interacts, and how we can kind of track that interaction, and how those interactions produce different kinds of vulnerability for Filipino migrants in the United States. Scholars like Rasil Mohares and Carolyn Howe, but just in addition to the deep research work, just the beauty of the storytelling, the invitation to write historically, with both an excitement for and a passion for what we can record and retell. One of the things that I always appreciate about Rasil Mohares is he publishes everywhere, right? Like it could be a journal that I have never heard of, and there'll be a beautiful, short vignette that comes out of there. Um, and with Carolyn Howe, like the deep thinking like that goes into every piece that she writes. I was just rereading an essay of hers about the Dovey Beams affair, that was in the Marcos era reader that just came out of the Ateneo, and it's so brilliantly researched, and it's so kind of mindful of race, gender, and empire, and while kind of pushing us to kind of attend to what this kind of scandal tells us about Philippine history more broadly, right? Like kind of some of the salaciousness of the scandal, but also to an invitation to think beyond that. So those are some of like the scholars that have really informed me in terms of like a literary figures. Like the books that have stayed with me over these last few years are Glenn Diaz's The Quiet Ones and Mia Alvar's In the Country, right? Like again, both of them really like beautiful and kind of detailed writing that really takes you in and really kind of moves you, right? Like, and they are, literary writers that push me like to try to be a better writer than the boring historical writing that I do, right? Like, because you kind of bear witness to how literary writing can really move you and change you. Other writers that I have really appreciated, and like maybe they aren't as far back as as this question kind of calls for, but Greg Grandin's work, the sort of clarity of like the sort of imperial history, but also the clarity of political purpose that is behind it. Similarly, Moon Ho Jung's work, which also does touch on the Philippines, right? Like the sort of precision there in the kind of historical and political purpose of the work. Vincent Bevins' work in like sort of the detail and the wide-ranging engagement with different activist movements and what they could and what they can teach us. Um, and a work that has been sticking with me recently is the work of Annalise Orlek. She wrote a book called Storming Caesar's Palace. And there is just such um, like a clear admiration in the work that she expresses for the activists that she writes about, even when she is pointing out um, their shortcomings at times. Like there is the way that it's clear that these activists are people that she really admires, that are people that make her hopeful in what is otherwise a really dire and kind of terrible time. Some work that is some upcoming work that's really exciting to me. Eri Kitada, someone who writes about Japanese settler communities in the first half of the 20th century in the Philippines. A scholar named Michael Hawkins, who worked on a sort of historical geography of the port of Manila. That's really exciting. Michael Salgarolo, who writes about wrote a wonderful essay on like Filipinos in Louisiana. Does these incredible walking tours of New York and of New Orleans. Does fantastic work. My other colleagues that are working on histories of and around martial law, right? Joyce Sales, Karen Buenavista Hanna, Michael Castaneda, Sharon Kinsat's book, Insurgent Communities has just come out. All of those scholars and their work is really exciting. In terms of creative work, the work of Gantala Press in the Philippines. It's a women's press in the Philippines, and they have done really amazing work in support of different communities in sort of publishing and circulating women's work in the Philippines, and kind of creating itself as a space for literary production, for literary and scholarly production that I think is in itself a really important and crucial kind of activist work that is going on.